then I put it in the front of the episode, and the people love it.
Oh,
I
nice.
actually don't know if they love it.
Just,
I've never heard
I
any
was
feedback.
wondering who you were
I like it.
referencing. Who are these
Yeah, we've
people?
never gotten any feedback for disliking or liking it, but I still do it because it just adds value to my life.
That sounds delightful. All right, then any value that you want to add to your life, I'm sure other people want to add to theirs, Nick.
Oh, that's very sweet. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Between Two Coaches. We're on a mission to make fitness more human. Snark sold separately. I'm Coach Amanda, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host,
Coach Nick. Thanks so much for joining us. We have a great episode today. It's part 2 in our series, Coaching the Whole Human, where we'll talk to a running coach, a clinical psychologist, and a mindset coaches and dive into really what it means to coach the whole human. And today we have a clinical psychologist, among other things, Dr. Lara Pence. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Lara.
Oh gosh, thanks for having me. It sounds like we're gonna have a good time. So a good time for an hour is like something I'll sign up for any day of the week.
Yeah, it's gonna be a blast. We have some fun topics, and I think it's gonna be just a lot of great information for athletes and coaches and just runners alike. So, but first, why don't you, for anyone who might not know, why don't you tell everyone a little bit about yourself, and we'll go from there.
Sure. So, as you mentioned in the intro, I'm a licensed clinical psychologist out of Colorado, and I work primarily with professional and elite athletes. I like to make the distinction between being a clinical psychologist and a sports psychologist because that just in and of itself really sort of designates that like I'm looking at the whole human as opposed to just sort of that particular arena in sport. And so when athletes come to me, for sure, sometimes they come to me because they are looking to improve their performance, but also they come to work with me to learn about other things that sort of might be impacting their life, whether it's their relationships or their career or finding joy or being in alignment with their values. So a lot of the work that I do with athletes really extends beyond sports. So that's my private practice. And then I'm also the founder of something called the Coaches Collective, which Nick, you were a part of,
Yeah.
which is a program for coaches who are looking to learn more about human behavior and to basically increase their psychological acumen and skills in working with their athletes because athletes are whole humans. And so it's important for coaches, in my opinion, to just even have a baseline knowledge of like how humans work and how does shame work and what does anxiety look like and how do you connect and what really is confidence, those kinds of things. So the programs helps sport coaches of any kind feel more confident in being sort of skilled in that way.
Yeah, it was awesome. I learned so
Aw.
much. As someone who went in thinking I like already sort of did that, I walked away thinking, well, I barely scratched the surface of what I thought was coaching, the whole human, and walked away with so much, and just some great people as a part of it. I love the cohort
Yeah.
idea of like working with others.
Yeah, it was awesome. It was definitely like every time that I run one of those cohorts, I'm just so inspired, honestly, by like all of the coaches that are involved and interested and engaged and really want to learn more and are willing to kind of raise their hand and say, like, I don't have all the answers, which I think sometimes coaches have a really hard time doing and be vulnerable in that way. So yeah, it's like so fun to bring coaches together in that way and help support their journey and really just becoming better coaches.
Yeah. I think that that's my takeaway from it was just I think your big point there was asking questions and like not feel like coaches just feeling like they don't know the whole answer
Yeah.
and like feeling comfortable asking for help or advice or things like that because we're all the more you're willing to learn and grow, the better you'll be because if you think you know it all, then you're vastly wrong because no
Right.
one does. And if you're not growing, you're not, helping your athletes.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Well, coaches ask their athletes to grow all the time, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's like basically what you're doing anytime you ask your athlete to do anything is to grow and is to learn and is to improve or to work on or to build something. And so I believe that coaches should be doing the same thing right alongside their athletes.
co-signed. So I guess that leads us into telling us a little bit more about you as a clinical psychologist and what your role is with your athletes, how you can help them and how you do help them, of course.
Sure. So I think, a lot of people think that they need to have a problem to go to therapy or to see a psychologist. Um, and I don't believe that to be true. I think that actually what is most important when you think about whether or not you want to see a psychologist is to think about whether or not you want to have something different in your life. Whether you want to have a different feeling, whether you want to think differently, whether you want to have a different kind of relationship, whether you want to have a different kind of performance in sport. So when athletes come to me, one of the things that I ask them in sort of like our initial work together is, what do you want to be different? Like, how is something right now, and what do you want it to look like in 3 months? Like, literally, the question I ask is, okay, so let's say we've been working together for 3 months, and after 3 months, I say, hey, how do you think this is going? And you say, I think it's going great. What would need to happen in that 3 months? Like, what would need to be different in that 3 months to feel like this is a success? So, athletes will come to me, as I said earlier, for a bunch of different reasons. Maybe they're struggling in their relationships, their personal relationships, and trying to sort of figure out how to be the best that they can be in their sport while also having a healthy relationship. Or they might come to me because, depending on what sport they're in, they might not, even though they're a professional athlete, they might need to have a side hustle, let's say. So they might sort of come to me for thinking about how to lead in their career or what they want out of their career. Um, and other times, for sure, athletes come to me because maybe stress is impacting their performance, or anxiety is impacting their performance, or just some of the negative thoughts that they might have, or low confidence that they have, or impacting their performance. So my job as a psychologist, as I see it, really is to just keep generating questions. I used to think early in my career that my job was to generate solutions. And that's sort of when I came from therapy at that problem focused idea, sort of like, well, you're coming to me with a problem, I'm going to help create a solution. But I've learned that actually my role really is to ask better questions and to leave better questions out there, and to have my clients generate the solutions themselves, or acknowledge that there might not be a solution, because sometimes there isn't a solution in life. So that's really sort of the way that I work as a therapist, and how I see my role as a psychologist with the athletes that I work with.
I think it's so important. Like, I think even coaches think like we need to have the answers, we need to solve problems. A lot of times it's like you said, either asking the right questions or just listening, right? Like you can solve problems just by listening to someone. Athletes sometimes will talk themselves through their problems. Sometimes there isn't an answer and they just need to talk through it. Like, before a race when the nerves are high, there's probably not an answer to why an athlete is feeling a way, but they just need to get it out, right? And they need to talk through it. And you just need to ask why you're feeling this way, or what possibly could be going on, versus like, oh, I'll solve it by we'll just run harder, do more of this, or those types of things, right? And so I think like it's really just communication and asking things and getting someone to think in a critical way is so helpful for them, because they'll solve the problem themselves. You're just there kind of guiding.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of my favorite words is curious, and I think it's really important for us to just be more curious generally as human beings. But I think it's really important for us to sort of come at wonderings with a sense of curiosity instead of a sense of criticism. And I think that we're really, really good at criticizing ourselves. Like, just generally as a society, we're quite hard on ourselves. And I think that we need to be more curious and less critical. So if we can even just change the tone that we say something, that we ask ourselves in our head, for example, like, a lot of my athletes, a lot of the humans that I work with, athlete or not, might say like, why do I do this? That's so critical. Like, that's just even just has a critical tone. Like, if you're a parent and you imagine saying to your child, why did you do that? Immediately you're saying like you did something wrong, right? Like you're sort of moving into that critical space, as opposed to something just even a little bit different, like, how come that was your choice? Like, it's just a little more curious. And so I think that we need to do a better job as humans, and for sure as like providers, whether you're a coach or a therapist, to be really curious and to role model that curiosity so that the individuals that you're working with can do that too. And I think sport is such a great arena to be curious in. Like, what am I capable of? Instead of like, why can't I do this? Or what what goal might I have this year instead of I think I should, So I think that there's a lot of room for curiosity in the space that we're in.
Just shifts that self-talk spiral.
Yeah. Love that. Um, so second question, or just next question. What does coaching the whole human mean to you?
So I think it means, like, first and foremost, instead of looking at the person that you're coaching as an athlete, you're looking at them as a whole human. You're realizing that they have lots of thoughts, lots of feelings, lots of beliefs, a certain set of values that extend beyond sport. That sport is a part of their life, right? And depending on what type of athlete you coach, whether you're coaching the everyday athlete or you're coaching the professional athlete, the amount in a pie chart of life that athlete engages in sport might change. For some, it might be like 80% of their life is sport. For somebody else, it might be 10% of their life is sport. For some, it might be 2%, right? Um, but either way, it's a whole human that interacts with the world outside of a sport context. And so I think that it's really important for coaches to remember that, like, the set of beliefs that their athlete has, the thoughts that their athlete has, the feelings that their athlete has, is first and foremost all should be seen through the lens of, like, the human experience, not just the athlete experience. Um, and I think it's really important for coaches to do that because, in essence, it makes them better understand the athlete in front of them. So, for example, like something we talk about in the Coaches Collective is shame. Shame is the part of the human experience. We all experience shame, right? Shame shows up in sport all the time. Shame shows up in relationships, like shame shows up everywhere. But if you can acknowledge that shame is part of the human experience, then you can start to recognize, like, okay, so it is going to show up in this human that's in front of me that's training for the Chicago Marathon. How it's going to show up, I'm not sure, but I'm going to learn more about shame because that's the human experience and I'm working with a human, right? So that, I think, is sort of what I think is important about seeing the whole human and then being able to coach from that perspective.
Yeah. I think like what I loved out of that is, I feel like there's a lot of new coaches, starting in this virtual world. And like, one of the things we really like to do here is just sort of like bring information to people, like to think more outside of like, most people are athletes and then they become a coach and then they just kind of coach like they're an athlete instead of coach like they're a coach, right? Because there isn't necessarily the best training. Like you can go to do Roadrunners Clubs associations training or UASTF, which is more centered around being a high school coach, around track programs. And there's other things that pop up, but like a lot of athletes who become coaches don't understand this side of it. And like, maybe they think there's barriers in what they should communicate to their athlete or like step over lines. But like, I think understanding that this person is a complex human with complex feelings that like that affects everything, and throwing numbers at them or harder workouts just because you did them in your life in a different complete environment and way than someone else doesn't solve that. And so we try and push people here to this, and this is why the series is here, to like think more of, well, what am I really doing as a coach? What should I be doing? Why is it more than just like 4x400 meters at X pace? Like it's, what that's the littlest, that's the most smallest part of their growth. Like everything else is going to matter more. And so, I loved how you explained it so well of like where this really is the whole human and why it matters.
Yeah. Well, and I think also, like, if coaches are really interested in helping their athlete achieve certain goals, they also have to remember that there are going to be things outside of sport that impact their ability to achieve that goal. So for example, like if you're working to have an athlete qualify for Boston, let's say, but this athlete is also really trying to navigate their job because they just got promoted, right? And they're trying to sort of figure out how to show up fully in their job in this new sort of like crux of their career, right alongside training, to qualify for Boston. Like, if you're looking at the whole human, you're going to take into consideration, okay, this person might actually be experiencing some imposter syndrome right now because they've just made this transition into this promotion, right? Do they feel confident there? Maybe not, because a lot of people, even when they get promoted, is actually when they feel the least confident, right? And so maybe they don't feel super confident, and that imposter syndrome might be showing up for them. So it actually could even be bleeding into their training, right? And that's maybe why I've noticed that they aren't filling in their logs as much or things of that nature, right? So like that's how as a coach it matters, because it impacts your athlete. Like their life impacts the way that they show up in sport and vice versa. And so as a coach, for you to be able to see that whole human and then sort of be curious again, like, I wonder how this promotion might be impacting their training. I wonder if I should ask how it's impacting their training. I wonder if I should adjust their training because of this promotion. Like, I wonder if we should change our goals. Like, these are all questions that I think coaches could be asking themselves along along the journey of seeing this human in front of them.
It just lends itself to the conversation of really anyone can. There's a difference between downloading a training plan and hiring somebody or outsourcing support, to guide you through. And it's our role as coaches, even as personal trainers, to kind of see the things outside of the training that will impact the training. So I love that. I guess it is a nice segue into our next topic, which is
Ooh, a
Treadway.
Treadway.
You spoke a little bit about it earlier with Nick, who was a part of the collective, but tell us more about the Coaches Collective and why you started it.
Yeah. So I actually sort of like the thought was kind of seeded back in 2021 when Simone Biles decided to leave the Olympics, and there was so much conversation around mental health in sport, and really like a lot of athletes kind of coming out and saying like, yes, this matters, or I've suffered from depression, or like anxiety is a real thing, like we're people too. And so there was a lot of conversation around like, okay, coaches need to understand that mental health, right, and mental wellness is an important part of the athlete experience. But I noticed that right alongside that, like it very much seemed like we were saying, hey, coaches, pay attention. But coaches are not experts in mental health unless they are, right? And just because you're a human also doesn't make you an expert at being human. Like I eat, so we could say that, like, I'm an expert at food, but actually not at all, right? Like dietitians are experts at food. So I think I started to notice this gap, that there was a lot of conversation around like it being really important to, to service the mental health of athletes and to make sure that sort of that is a consideration in training and in sport. But we weren't giving coaches the tools to do that, at least as far as I was concerned. There was maybe a program here or a class there that you could take. But generally speaking, the idea was send them to a therapist. And I'm a big believer that, like, number one, I don't think everybody should be in therapy. Number two, I don't believe that the answer should always be send them to a therapist. And number three, coaches have a responsibility to also get skilled in working with humans because that's who they're working with. And just being able to write a training plan and just being able to know sort of like the physiology of sport performance, to me, didn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. So that's kind of where like the seed of the idea of the Coaches Collective was planted. And so, who better than to build a program but myself? So I decided, okay, why not, right? I'm just going to go all in and try. And as a psychologist who's worked with professional athletes and non-professional alike, I certainly felt like not only did I have enough sort of information that could transcend sort of the clinical world over the sport world, but also, again, the curriculum was really just about like teaching coaches about humans and about sort of what shows up in sport the most. So the program is an 8-week program. It's both didactic and dynamic in its experience, in the sense that on Mondays you learn a lesson. I teach a lesson. It's a full hour of me teaching. And then on Thursdays, coaches who are in the cohort, and that can range anywhere from like 10 to 15 coaches, but you stay in your cohort, come together to process what they just learned, and to talk about it. And that part felt really important to me as well, because what I know as a group facilitator is that often people learn better and learn more when they're in a group versus when they're doing independent learning. And so to me, that part felt important for coaches who really wanted sort of like this full, robust experience of being able to process, for example, the lesson on shame. Like, what came up for you? How does this show up in your own life as a coach? How do you notice shame showing up in your athletes? And to hear from other coaches in their same sport and not in their same sport, what other coaches were seeing as well. So that was sort of like the idea for having kind of like those two elements of learning, the didactic and the dynamic. And yeah, I mean, I think I've just had such a blast doing it. It's been so wonderful to work with coaches that are truly invested in servicing their athletes more beyond just training and beyond just in performance. But the other thing that I love about it, which has kind of been this like really cool byproduct, is that coaches have just learned so much more about themselves. They really have. Like I've had coaches in there who have, and this might sound bad to the audience, but like who have left jobs, because they realize like I'm not happy, or they've decided to maybe send one of their athletes to somebody else because they realize, okay, I'm really not a good fit for this athlete, or they've decided to niche down who they want to work with, or they've decided to up their fee because they realize they're more valuable than they once identified themselves as. So like there's been this incredible sort of byproduct of coaches learning more about how to work with their athletes, which is coaches learning more about themselves. And it is true, like when you know better, you do better. And so if you know more about just the way that you operate as a human, you're going to work better with other humans in your life. And so that to me has also been like this really cool part of the Coaches Collective.
It's awesome. I loved my experience. Friend of the podcast, Kylie Van Horn, was the person who sort of got me on to following you and then finding the program. So shout out, Kylie. But everything you said, I think, is why I loved it. It is something that didn't really exist in this coaching space, especially and it wasn't necessarily running. Mine had a lot of runners, running coaches, but like we had all their coaches too. But just in this space where I am, like it really helped like show this idea of like why that matters and how much, and you could really impact someone's life from knowing a little more.
Yeah.
And to your point of growing yourself, like the more I learned about myself and my styles and like the coaches I had, the more I grew about how I could work with athletes and like what I've learned and what I've went through. So, in so many ways it helped me learn more about how to interact and have a relationship with athletes, but also how to have a relationship better with myself, too.
Yeah. Oh, I love hearing that. Nick, what a testimonial. Can I get a clip of that? Seriously though, like I think that is part of why I do this work, is because I think it's really powerful in that way. And the other thing is like this parallel process kind of happens. So if coaches are more interested in learning about themselves, right? Then they model that, athletes will be also more interested in learning about themselves, right? And sort of be more open and vulnerable. If coaches are more open and vulnerable, athletes will be more open and vulnerable. If coaches are more willing to ask about shame, athletes will be more willing to talk about shame. Like all of these things sort of matter. And I love that it feels like there truly is sort of like transformation happening not only within the Coaches Collective, but within the athletes the coaches are really working.
Yeah, all that I loved, and my favorite thing from the beginning was the athlete's journey and like this idea of like this transformation journey. And I always tell it to a lot of my athletes, that story of like this is what you're really transforming, and you're growing, and this is where you're hoping, where you're ending up, and doesn't necessarily have to be some PR on a clock. It's where your growth comes from.
Yeah, 100%. And I think like, I mean, one of the first things that I talk about in the curriculum, and Nick, you know this because you were in it, is like the power that coaches have. And coaches have power. And whether or not you want to think of yourself that way or not, doesn't matter. You do. You are in a powerful position. And I think when coaches downplay that power and don't think that they have impact and influence, they're much more likely to do harm to their athletes versus when they recognize, like, okay, this is a powerful relationship. This is a powerful, meaningful relationship to this person. Even if I only talk to them once a month, and even if the only way that we communicate is through like a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet, it doesn't matter. That's impact and influence. And so why not learn how to impact and influence in the best way possible, right? In like the most way. Like for all of the coaches listening, like you know what it's like when you think of past coaches that you've had and think of like the greats. You know, you think of like, this person was so awesome. Like they taught me this. And most of what they taught me actually transcended sport. Like be that coach. Be the coach that transcends sport.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of like lends our way to our next question. So, let's chat about some of the really important areas in your opinion where a coach can show up for their athlete.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the best things that a coach can do is learn what's human. Like, so for example, we just actually in the All Collective, which is like what happens when you complete the program, you can join every Tuesday. All the coaches who've been through the program are welcome to join. It's basically like an open kind of question and answer, but I come in with a topic. So today the topic was anxiety. So today we talked about how anxiety and being anxious is part of the human experience. Yes, there is obsessive compulsive disorder and generalized anxiety disorder and other anxiety disorders. But having anxiety, like just experiencing being anxious every once in a while, or even a little bit more than every once in a while, is part of the human experience. And so if a coach can understand that, let's just say that alone, and then when their athlete says to them, like, I don't know, I'm just really anxious about this race, then a coach is able to be like, yeah, that sounds really normal. Like, that's really human. It's really human to be anxious about a race. You know why? Because it matters to you. And oftentimes we worry about the things that matter deeply. Like you've trained for this for 6 months, you've been training for the Chicago Marathon or whatever it is, like, or maybe more than that, right? So you've put in time, you've put in money, you've sacrificed, right? Like those mornings when you would make pancakes for your kids, now you're out for that run. So of course this matters to you. And mattering sometimes creates worry. So it totally makes sense that you feel anxious. That's how, like, just even understanding as a coach, like, okay, anxiety isn't a disorder. There is an anxiety disorder, but being anxious is not a disorder. It's part of the human experience. So I think if coaches can better understand how to normalize and how to humanize the things that we go through as people, I think that can really help their athletes just feel like, okay, maybe not such a big deal. Uncomfortable that I feel anxious about this race, but doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to have a panic attack about this race, right? So I think if I were to name like what's the most important thing for coaches to like help their athletes with, it's normalizing and humanizing certain experiences like anxiousness or like shame or even like feeling depressed every once in a while or like post race blues, right? Like that is a real thing. That is definitely a real thing that people experience, right? And we experienced that in all arenas. Again, this is where it's like the whole human. Like if you have a project that you've been working on like so hard at work for months and months and months, and then you finally got to deliver that, and then like a few days after you're kind of like, oh gosh, I'm feeling like, I don't know, like where do I invest all my time? Like it's kind of the same thing as post race blues, right? So understanding the human part of that, I think, is really important for coaches to be able to translate that to their athletes.
Yeah, one of the go ahead,
No,
Amanda.
I think we all need to let each other know that we're not alone. It's like we
Yeah.
need to be able to feel honest and open with the people who we are trusting our training with enough to share these vulnerable moments. And the trainer and the coach needs to let them know that they're not alone in their feeling. I find that sometimes I share on social media conversations I have with my athletes like, anonymously throughout the week. The one takeaway I get or the biggest engagement statement I get, feeling I get is, wow, I thought I was the only one who felt XYZ sentiment that I'm sharing on social media, whether that's anxiety around a race or feeling uncomfortable in their body. It's just, you got to feel less alone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. I mean, I think it's a huge part of like being able to connect because when we feel like we're alone, we also want to sort of like wall ourselves off a little bit and not connect. And connecting is really healing. And so feeling like you're not as alone can maybe open yourself up to greater connection.
Yeah, I laughing a little bit, Amanda, because I was going to say the same thing, which is like one of the most powerful things I hear from athletes is like when they tell you that they feel seen, like that you help them feel
Yeah.
seen, like through something. And like when you bring up anxiety or anxiousness, or like, having athletes feel like, oh, that's normal, like, like just normalizing things. And like, I talked about it on the podcast, but I've watched Inside Out a million times with my kids too. And like, just like being a little choked up around the anxiety part of it, but like, being able to talk to my girls and like having this movie that kind of puts, something towards these feelings of normalizing them. Because when I was a kid, I was clearly anxious, but it wasn't something people talked about in 1990. It wasn't really a word tossed around. It wasn't a feeling that was normalized. It was, oh no, don't do that. And so like, but like helping, a lot of athletes we work with are adults who grew up through those times, and like helping them acknowledge like, oh, well, you're talking about being anxious and like you're okay with it. And like, or, you're okay with like, shame or other things around like this. Like, it's so helpful as a coach when you can share those real feelings, and like your athletes see that, and like people have connected with me and been like, I like that you can talk about things like that I feel like are only, deep inside me, or like that no one else has, because a lot of social media is just a, place where everyone shares their best moments and everything's great and rainbows and sunshines and, unicorns. But like there's so much more that goes on, and like you can have unicorns and rainbows, but you can also have sadness too, and you can talk about both because they're both part of the human experience that we should all be embracing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love Inside Out too.
Haven't watched. I think that's next on my I know you love. I know you're a stan.
I know.
Huge stan.
So it really is so good. And it's such a good like bridge to talk to kids.
Yeah.
I guess I have to find some children to talk to.
Just grab some off the street and be like, "Want to watch a movie with me?"
No, maybe my niece will get down. I guess, we kind of spoke about it earlier, but the coaches and the coaches collective, you're giving them the opportunity to feel more comfortable being vulnerable themselves and releasing that shame with themselves. So let's talk a little bit about boundaries when it comes to coaches and what they're set. How should coaches make sure they're holding true to themselves and setting boundaries? Because there's still a job. We always talk about this. And by we, I mean, I definitely always talk about this, how our industry is it can get murky because we do what we love. And so people sometimes will look at it as not work, but as a hobby. And so, getting emails or text messages at all hours of the night can be, some coaches have made normal for them. And I personally have always felt like we got to set some parameters. So I think that would be, how coach, it would be really helpful to hear from you, how coaches make sure they're holding true to themselves and how they can adapt over time.
Well, so when I think of boundaries, like the most simple definition for me is just what's okay and what's not okay. It's like a simple delineation, right? Between what's okay over here and what's not okay over here. And the truth is we all have different boundary structures. I mean, there might be some coaches who like are night owls and they don't go to bed until 1 p.m. So like 11 p.m. feels like time when work is, or 1 a.m. So the 11 p.m. feels like when work is done, right? Other people like really like to keep like an 8 to 5 kind of structure in their life with time boundaries, right? So we all have different boundary structures, and there are also all different kinds of boundaries. There are time boundaries, right? So like the boundaries that you put up around time, what's okay, what's not okay. There are financial boundaries, there are emotional boundaries, there are physical boundaries. So I think first and foremost, like we throw around this term boundaries, like how do we have better boundaries? But you can't really have better boundaries unless you know what kind of boundary you're interested in having in the first place, right? So like if you're a coach, for example, and you find yourself constantly waiving your fee for your athletes, that's a financial boundary, right? But alongside that might be an emotional boundary, because the emotion that you might be warding off is anxiety, for example. Like, well, it would be super anxious. I would get super anxious if I said, no, I'm not willing to like lower my fee or waive my fee, right? So I'm going to avoid that anxiety by just letting myself bulldoze right over my own boundary. So I think like when, in thinking about like how do coaches have boundaries, the first thing that I would ask a coach to think about is like, well, where? where do you want to have a boundary? Do you want to have it in finances? Do you want to have it in time? Do you want to have it in your emotions? Do you want to have it in physical space? So to get a little bit more clear on like what type of boundary they're interested in changing. And then I think, then it goes back to the question of like, well, what's okay and what's not okay for you? Like take away what your athlete might experience with this boundary, because that's often where coaches get caught up. It's like, well, I don't want my athlete to be mad at me, or I don't want my athlete to think I'm not supporting them if I don't text them back at 1 a.m. Or I don't want my athlete to think that I think I'm so good at my job and that's why I'm charging this. Like take away what you think your athlete would think. And you ask yourself the question, what's okay and what's not okay for you? Right. So I think like just even like what is the boundary and then what's okay and what's not okay within the boundary are helpful things to have. And then I think, yeah, to your point, Amanda, like it's important to remember that you can pivot at any time. You can change your boundary structure. You have the power and the agency to change your boundary structure. So, and comes up a lot actually in the Coaches Collective when we work specifically on boundaries, because a lot of coaches, when we have that Thursday meeting after the boundary lesson on Monday, are like, I realize that I have no boundaries when it comes to communication and athletes reaching out to me. And so my encouragement, of course, is for some of these coaches to set those boundaries, right? To help set up that containment for their athletes. And then they ask like, well, how do I do that? Because they expect that I'll be available whenever like they want me to be, because that's how I've always been. So then I say, tie it to your values, right? Or clear communication. So let them know like, hey, one of my values is family. And I realize that I've been a little out of alignment with that value because I am responding to text messages during times when I would normally be with my family. So I'm going to pivot to be in more alignment with my values. And from now on, I would appreciate like that the texts be contained between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. Right. And then you could even say like, however, I totally understand that before a race, if you want to text me like the night before a race, that's totally doable, right? So you can flex a little bit within the boundaries for sure. But I think it's really important for anyone, coaches or not, to remember that you can change your boundary structure at any time. That does not mean people are going to like it. That does not mean that people are necessarily
They have
going
to
to like
respect
it.
it.
But I think actually, you'd be surprised though that sometimes very much people understand it. So for example, like one of the things that I've been really, really, really proud of the coaches in the Coaches Collective for doing is raising their fee to be commensurate with their expertise and their experience. And surprising or non-surprisingly to me, but surprisingly to them, when they've done that, they email me and they're like, nobody cared. Everybody was like willing to pay my new fee, and they thought that people would fire them or that they'd be like, forget it, I don't want to pay that. So I think the other thing is to remember that like sometimes you might be creating a story in your head around, if I shift this boundary, everybody's going to be so mad and so upset. For sure, sometimes that happens, but also sometimes it is a story that you're creating. So I think just allowing yourself to like check in with yourself and ask yourself, okay, am I still okay with this boundary? Is this still okay for me? And or do I need to change that? And also like, are you operating out of a place of fear? Because often we will bulldoze over our own boundaries or not put them in the first place because we are afraid of something. We might be afraid that athletes won't like us. We might be afraid that athletes will leave us. We might be afraid that athletes won't even find us. So I think it's really important to also remember that like a boundary actually should be set for your own like health, not necessarily to avoid fear or to ward off fear. So I think that's the other important piece about boundaries.
Yeah, one of the things you said, I think on one of the classes was, if once you start doing work, it's like takes like an hour to sort of like, I think you said something along these lines, but like an hour to sort of get out of the work cycle
Yes.
once you start. And that was like a big thing for me in boundaries of like, because I used to just, oh, I'll just start this, do these logs now or do this, that here. And then all of a sudden I'm like, oh, I can't sleep, or I'm like wired up an hour, like 45 minutes later. And I'm like, okay, like for me, it was important to start setting boundaries of like, I will do this stuff during these times, but like, I can't just turn on my brain to do a little bit of work here and not expect it to like still linger an hour later, keep me up at night because I started working too late. So that was like very important to me. And, I think the other thing is like a lot of coaches maybe probably suffer, myself included, imposter syndrome is a big part of like being a coach. Like, why would anyone choose me? Like, so like holding to your boundaries is a lot of fear behind, being an imposter. Like, why would anyone choose me unless I, let them have a lower rate, or, talk to me whenever they want, or like push away from the limits and, the things I've set up already as part of like my coaching. And so I think it's important to realize that, like, if you're good at your job, people will respect that, but it's communication at the end of the day, right? Like, communicate. Don't just say I'm changing everything and don't tell, like, no other context. Like, that's harder for people to understand if you, like you said, align to your values or align to reasoning that your athletes can understand. And then the last part is, like, then you need to operate under those constraints. So you say you're going to work from 9 to 5 and you don't respond to someone at 4, unless it's like, an emergency, but you're never responding during these hours. Like, then you've sort of set up boundaries that, like, now your athlete's like, well, you change things and you're still not available. Like, so, you need to be honoring what you set to.
Yes, totally. Yeah, I 100% agree with that, Nick. I think it's really important for us to regularly be in check with, like, am I sticking to my own boundaries? Sorry if you hear sneezing in the background, that's my dog. Because if I'm bulldozing over my own boundaries, I'll also be more likely to have other people bulldoze over those boundaries too. So yeah, I think that's a good point. And I love that you brought up communication, because I think that that's really important. And I think that, this is the other thing that I would encourage coaches to do, is give themselves permission to see themselves as human too. And so when you change a boundary structure or you shift something in your coaching practice, be human about it. Like acknowledge your athletes, to Nick's point, like the why, the how come you're doing something. Every year I give myself a raise in my private practice, and every year I explain why. And sometimes it's the same reason and sometimes it's different, but I think that it's really important for people to hold on to, like, your how come also.
I love that.
Yeah, me too. So along those lines, or shifting forward. So we had Mario Fraioli on, and we talked about how impactful establishing a relationship is with athletes as a coach. And so, can you talk a little bit about relationship building for coaches and what that looks like from your lens?
Yeah, sure. So I think, listen, like, this is just what we know about humans. Humans are much more likely to do something you ask them to do if they care about you, period. Right. And you are more likely to do the same. And so establishing that relationship, I think, is really important between athletes. And I think, in my opinion, that comes first and foremost from getting to know the human. They want to feel like they matter. This is just, all humans like to feel like they matter. But in a coaching relationship, especially where maybe you have, quite a few athletes, and you might even just only be working off of a log to communicate, it's really important for them to feel like they're not just a name in a log, that they're a human. So I think the onboarding process is a great place for coaches to begin that process of relationship building. And I think that starts with asking questions, whether you're doing it through like a Google form or actually in person, about their life, about the things that matter to them, not just about their history of an injury, or if you ask about their history of an injury, which is a great question to ask, how about also asking about, like, their history of mental illness? How about asking about that, right? Like, how about asking about their history of working with other coaches? What have they liked? What haven't they liked, right? So to start to acknowledge and put out there that, like, hey, I see you. Like, I see, Amanda, to your point, like, I see you as more than just someone who I'm going to build a training plan with, but someone that I'm going to build a relationship with. So I think that part is really important. The other part that I think is important is that in order to build a relationship, they have to know a little bit about you too. So you have to allow yourself to be vulnerable, to put yourself out there in some ways. It doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot of self-disclosure about the personal things in your life. But I think, for example, it's important for, like, Nick, your athletes to know that you have kids. Like, I think that that's an important thing to understand about a human. Listen, I'm a therapist where oftentimes disclosure is not exactly promoted. But in my first meeting with any client, I tell them that I'm like the mother of 2 boys, and I tell them that I love being active, that I climb and that I run, and some of the things that matter to me, so that they also know that I'm a human, like, that they can connect to and plug into. So for me, I think that onboarding process for coaches can be a real a really great time to get to know someone. And that doesn't extend to one-on-one coaching. That can be team too. I mean, if you're like a youth sports coach, for example, working on a soccer team, like as a group, get to know your kiddos, but also pull one kiddo at a time with your assistant coach or whatever, and get to know them a little bit. Get ask questions. What kind of video games do you like to play? Like, tell me what school is like for you. What's the name of your best friend? Like just ask some questions to get to know them a little bit so that they feel like a human. That is part of relationship building.
Yeah, the thing I take away, I think it's important to, share a little bit of yourself. Like, I remember whenever I go into kindergarten, the teachers always share a little bit about themselves and a couple slides to the kids, and it's really for the parents because the kids at kindergarten barely can read. But at the same time, like as a coach, you can sharing a little bit about yourself and being real is helpful, right? Like it helps people see you as also a human on the other end, and not just the world of coaching that was 20 years ago, where it's like the coach is on a pedestal above you and you listen to coach, and it isn't a working invested relationship. It is a I'm in charge. And the more you're unwilling to share or invest back, because athletes invest their time, their goals, their money into you, like they want something back. They want to know you're invested in them. They want you to be excited when they get a promotion, or with them when something horrible happens. Like, not that you can fix it, but like that you're there on their team, right? And so they're more willing to share that part of their life, which means they're more willing to share what's going on in their running and their fears and things around it. And I think you're exactly right. I have a questionnaire I send out to athletes asking for a lot of things, and some of the things I adapted from your collective, but just to kind of understand, like, how do you take, are you good at like listening to like directions from coaches, or like how do you feel about certain ways, or like what is your biggest thing that's overcoming? Like, is it confidence or anxiety or like belief? Like those types of things are just helpful things that you're asking, so your athlete knows like you're interested, and also that you can learn as a coach because they'll show up at some point for sure.
Yeah, I love that, Nick. Those are all really great things.
So we were talking about it a little bit before, but outside of coaching an athlete through their workouts, through their training plan, how would you advise coaches, or what do you share with coaches to help them navigate with their athletes, an athlete's injury, or them going through a period of grief, or maybe the athlete has shared with their coach that they're separating from their spouse, or a major life event?
So, I mean, I think one of the first things that I would say is like, don't leave. A lot of, especially when it comes to injury, a lot of coaches will be like, oh, they don't need me anymore. So like they might write an email that's like, okay, when you're back, when you're in, when you get cleared to run, reach out and I'll be here. Don't do that. Like, I'll just blanketly say, don't do that. Even if they've decided, hey, I'm going to take a break from coaching, I would encourage you to say, totally understand. Is it okay if I check in every once in a while? Right? Because again, like if you're interested in maintaining a connection, then maintain a connection, maintain that relationship. So, and that's about seeing like the whole human. In what other relationship, when somebody says like, I'm going through a hard time, would you say, okay, let me know when you're done? Right? Like that's just not, I mean, I wouldn't do that. I don't know. I'm sure there are people out there that would, but I think like in coaching too, again, like if you are looking at the whole human, and I realize it's not necessarily a friendship or or a personal relationship, but still it's a relationship, right? So I think like that's just one thing I want to say off the bat is like if you have an athlete that's going through an injury, like don't immediately assume that the best option is for you to leave. And the other reason is beside every physical injury is always a mental injury when there is something, something goes on. So, and you as a coach can help your athlete through that for sure. You don't have to be a therapist to do that. So, I mean, there might be times where a therapist would be really necessary, but I think also like it's important for coaches to feel empowered to help their athletes through that process. But I think the thing that I would say is like, if you have an athlete that's just going through a hard time, like a life transition, is to show up, to like keep showing up consistently and with reliability, because normally life transitions include uncertainty, right? They include the unknown. And you literally may be the most consistent thing in their life. So keep being consistent, keep being predictable. Because when this person feels like sand is just falling through their hands and they can't grab onto anything, they'll want to grab onto something. And if you can be predictable and if you can be consistent and if you can show up for them, that does wonders. And then I would say, like, give yourself permission to be curious and check in. Again, you don't have to be a therapist to have a conversation about how your athlete is doing in their personal life. Now, if it feels like some of the conversation extends way beyond your level of comfort and you want to refer them to a therapist, that's fine. But if you know that an athlete, for example, is going through a divorce or going through a separation, and it's been a month since they've brought it up, it's okay for you to say, hey, how are you doing? Like, that's okay for you to say, right? They may want to talk about it or they may not. But I always think it's important for you to acknowledge that you can be curious in this person's life. That is an okay place to be. And going back to sort of that idea of mattering, they are going to feel like they matter, like you care, like you're showing up for them. And it's going to help not only in the reliability arena, but also in the trust arena. Like, oh, Nick, I can trust Nick because I told this really important thing to Nick a month ago and he remembered it. Like, he sees me, right? So I think it helps in all of that relationship building that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, what really I think I've always found important, and athletes have said this to me, is having an injury is a very lonely time.
Yeah.
Usually you do a lot of runners run in groups or do some sort of socializing through running in some way, and so you feel like you lose your group. You feel like maybe your race is gone where you were going to see people, and it feels very lonely. And then it feels like, what did I do wrong? I caused this thing, and so when that happens, when the person who's been on their team and guiding them disappears, like, you feel even more alone, right? And so as a coach, like, it's not about fixing their injury. You can't fix the bone. Like, there's no text I can write that fixes a stress fracture. I haven't figured out what to write yet. Maybe there is. But, you can't, but you can show up and you can sort
Yeah.
of, if you keep reaching out, and all it takes is, hey, how are you doing? Or, hey, how's it going? Or, if I'd had athletes just for almost a year, I reached out to an athlete who'd been hurt every couple of weeks and, not getting better, getting worse. And just, I don't have the answer. I don't know what the injury was. I didn't know the fix, but just every week, every couple weeks reaching out, like, she really appreciated it. And like a year later when she got healthy, she's like, I absolutely want to work back together. Like, it was so helpful for you to constantly reach out. Like, I missed this thing that I enjoyed. And so, I share that story just to say, like, it doesn't take a lot to reach out to people. And, even when they're on a break, like, obviously they would be on a break when they're injured, but that doesn't mean you still can't be their coach.
Yeah.
And like, coaching is about more of just show, and it's a text, right? It's not like, you're having, it doesn't have to be more than that, but just that check-in is so powerful to them when they're alone and they can't get through this injury.
Yep. Yep. I totally agree, Nick. I really do. I think it's again, like, coaches remembering that this is a human in front of them and like being able to sort of extend what their expectations are. Like, a lot of times what I hear from coaches, especially when they're considering doing the coaches collective, is like, I'm like, scope of practice, like, kind of going back, Amanda, to boundaries, like, what can I talk about with athletes, and like, where is that out of my like scope of practice as a coach? And I think, I mean, honestly, like, we've become so rigid in things like that. And I think that we need to like expand a little bit outward and acknowledge that, like, talking about feelings, let's just say in this case, like talking about maybe some fear or anxiety that now has come up because of this injury. Like, you don't need to be a licensed mental health professional to do that. You can be an informed coach that has maybe done the coaches collective and knows how to talk about it better or whatever, but like, you can show up in a different way than maybe just that coaching hat.
Yeah, it's so good. I think it's so important, and that's like, that's that stuff we talked about earlier. As new coaches, come into the coaching realm, like, this is the stuff that matters. Just caring, right? Like, just
Yeah.
showing you care
Yeah.
makes the world of difference. It has nothing to do with the perfect workout or the perfect training block that you've mastered. It doesn't exist. Like, it's just being there and caring, and that person will run and perform better, and also just perform better in their life, because you're not just the coach of the clock, you're the coach of their life, right? Like, everything around the sport revolves around their life, and both affect each other. So show up in a way to help make that person's life better, but also make their sport better.
Yep. Mhm.
Yeah. So, as coaches, what can you do as a coach to self-evaluate yourself and grow over time?
Great question. The last lesson in the curriculum, Nick.
And the last question in our list.
I mean, I think it starts with just even being willing to self-evaluate. Like, I think that's one thing is like there might be coaches listening that's like, wait, what do you mean I have to self-evaluate? Like, ask yourself, like, how am I doing? Like what are my goals as a coach? Have I met those goals as a coach? Like, where do I feel successful? Where do I feel like I could grow? I think that's really important, is to just sort of be willing to self-evaluate and know that in that it might be hard. Like you mentioned earlier, Nick, like inquiring about, like, do you take feedback well? Like, how well do you listen to coaches? Like, so in self-evaluation, that's not an easy process. It's not an easy process for us to look in the mirror and be like, how am I really doing? Right. So I think you have to be willing to get uncomfortable with self-evaluation. Um, and then I think you just have to like hit some of the questions, right? Like, first and foremost, like, am I in alignment with my values in coaching? Like, are the things that do the things that matter to me, are those showing up in the way that I coach? And if not, does that mean that I need to move more in alignment with my values, or that maybe I need to change my values, right? And then I think boundaries comes up, right? Like, are there any boundary structures that maybe I need to work on, or maybe I need to change, right? How might I go about doing that, right? And then I think, of course, like just taking a look at some other just literal metrics for one's coaching practice in terms of like, am I feeling sort of as financially successful as I want to be? It's okay to make money coaching. Like, that is an okay thing to do, right? So I think it's important to just ask yourself some questions around that part of coaching for you if you have your own practice, right? But I think mainly with self-evaluation, like the thing that people need to do the most in order to self-evaluate is to step into that level of discomfort and to allow themselves to be honest, because normally we don't self-evaluate because it's uncomfortable, because we really actually don't like looking in the mirror so much, right? Or we have a tendency to trend in one direction or the other. We completely beat ourselves up about everything, or we don't beat ourselves up about anything, right? And everything's great and everything's fine and I don't need to change a damn thing. So I think we need to sort of like meet in the middle somewhere. I'm not interested in people beating themselves up, but I am interested in people being curious about, like, could I do this differently, right? Like, is there something here that I could do differently? And then also, what's going really well? What do I not want to change? What feels really good for me right now?
Yeah. I don't think a lot of coaches do that. It is very uncomfortable. I mean,
Scary.
just self-evaluating yourself in any
Yeah.
part of life is scary, right? Because you don't want to uncover things that you don't want to necessarily know, but like that are happening. But like, where it's uncomfortable is where the growth is, right? And so
Yeah.
you could just keep doing the same thing over and over again and never grow, or you could acknowledge like, this might not be working, or maybe I am not following my boundaries. It's probably always if you just want to start anywhere with self-evaluation, start with your boundaries. Like, think about all the boundaries, think about the ones you set. Are you honoring them, or are you not? And how could you do a better job of honoring them, right? Like, that's an easy self-evaluation, because yes, it's still a little uncomfortable, because eventually if you do want to change them, you will have to have a conversation. And conversations are scary, but at the same time, it's going to be a place where you can start, and you can sort of what when you're overdoing your boundaries, and it takes little self-reflection to go, oh, I'm always working till 11, I said I'm going to stop at 8. Like
Totally.
that's a good place to start. Some of the other stuff, maybe it's a little more messy, but like start where you can. Like, whatever is something that feels attainable, start there, and you'll find that as you start self-evaluating, it'll be easier probably to do more.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Mm-hmm. Agreed.
This has been fun. Can it get more fun, Nick?
It can, with our super secret interview questions. Are you
better
ready?
Reveal the
Fire away.
Secrets. All right, here they come. They're rapid fire, but you can take as long as you want, and I read them very
Love
slowly.
rapid fire. Okay, great.
So, question the first: what's the best piece of advice you've ever received?
Under promise, over deliver.
Good one.
I like it.
That.
I'm gonna try to do that.
Yeah.
For the rest of the week.
All right. Question number 2. What's one thing that people are generally surprised to find out about you?
That I'm an introvert.
Same.
I'm surprised.
See?
No, I'm not actually, because I feel like I feel like introvert versus extrovert has been like this thing where you just see someone and they like chat a lot and you're like, oh, that person's obviously extrovert. I'm like, it's much more complicated than that. It's like it's not like who talks, it's like where you get your energy from. Like I love talking to people, then I need to go sit in a room in the dark with the lights off and recover.
Yep.
Like so there's only, and if I'm in like a giant party with 100 people, like that is my nightmare. Even though like give me 5 people, I will chat the entire night, right?
Yeah.
So and there's levels to everything. But
Totally.
it's not, extrovert isn't just like, oh, you're chatty. It's like how your energy kind of replenishes itself, right?
That's right.
But so I'm not really surprised, but I just wanted to say that. All right. Question number 3. What's something you wish more people understood about your industry?
That we are different from that, in particular, psychologists are different from master level therapists as well as life coaches.
Yeah, that's a good one. Life coaches have taken over the world, and they are not what we think they are.
That's right. Yep.
I won't. That's a conversation for your podcast when you start it. No, I love these answers. They're so good. Back to you, Amanda.
You are you done with your questions?
We rapid
That
fired
was
them.
quicker
Yes.
than I anticipated. Well, I really this it's quite rapid. Well, this was a really wonderful conversation. I think I also have to give kudos to Coach Nick for coming up with this series. In case I did not do that in the first episode. By the way, if you're listening to this, you do not have to listen to this in any specific order. We did mention Mario's episode last week, but each one I can tell is going to be a golden nugget in and of itself. So Dr. Pence, can you please tell the people before we head out where they can find you? And if you are, if about Coaches Collective, if you're taking clients, all the things. Yeah.
Sure. So I'm on Instagram at drlarapence.com, and it's Lara for Lara. And then if you're interested in applying to the Coaches Collective, we have a cohort that's starting in the beginning of January. So you can head over to my website, drlarapence.com, and apply through the website. And then, I'm a real person doing real work. So my email is also on there. So if you're interested in working with me, shoot me an email.
That sounds great. It sounds like you are also a whole human. We love that. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Pence, for joining us. We hope that you enjoyed this episode, and you can reach out to Coach Nick, myself at any time on our Instagrams or at our email betweentwocoaches@gmail.com. And we will see you all next time for the final edition of Coaching the Whole Human. Good night.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.